Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the East 10 Outpost. I'm Cody, and today we're going to dive into a topic that's a bit of a hot button issue right now on social media. If you're around on X or any of the other major platforms, surely you've seen something recently about NAGPRA. But what exactly is it? What does it stand for? How long has this been around, and why is it just now being discussed so heavily in 2025? These are the questions we're going to dive into today as we talk to our very special guest, Steven. He's dove into the weeds and really taken the time to figure out what's going on behind NAGPRA. So I'm going to welcome now our very special guest at The Goob on social media. Steven, welcome.
Thank you, Cody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk about NAGPRA.
Well, I'm very glad to get to dive into it with you because honestly, I've taken a look into it and I've been able to figure out there's some well-meaning intentions behind it, but it seems to be missing the mark. And I don't honestly know where or why or what can even be done about this. So I'm hoping you'll be able to help answer these questions for me and for my viewers, and hopefully for other people online that are wondering what this is all about and maybe what we can do with it to make it better if it needs some correction. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'll do my best to summarize 35 years of legal history here and break it down hopefully in an understandable way. So it's a complicated topic, but I'll try and hit the highlights as best as I can.
Well, I appreciate that. And like you pointed out, this has been around since 1990. So tell me, what does the acronym NAGPRA even stand for? And what in 1990, set it into motion? Because it's been relatively quiet in the zeitgeist. So how did this start out in 1990 that it's kind of been, flying low key?
Right. So there's many reasons why this law was enacted, and NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act. And like I said, there's a variety of reasons this was enacted. One of the cases leading up to this was that an excavation was done and a whole bunch of bodies were found. About half of them were European, half of them were Native American. And the European bodies got reburied while the native bodies got taken for study. There was another instance where someone walked into a museum and saw their great uncle's grave goods on display. And that's rather recent, and it's a bit of a shock. And so there were good reasons to enact this law. And the initial purpose was to create a balance between scientists' ability to study these things and conduct archaeological research while also making sure that there was some basic respect given and consideration given to the Native Americans that were being studied. And there actually was a decent amount of controversy over this law when it was enacted. It was split about 50-50. Some archaeologists thinking that this would hinder research too much, while others, go, well, this is basic stuff. We need to be respectful. And the purpose of this law, beyond creating that balance, was to repatriate human remains that can be associated with modern-day tribes, along with those grave goods and sacred objects. And the sacred object has a strict legal definition where an object that is still required today for a sacred ritual. So an example of this, a lot of tribes had sacred copper plates that they would use during their green corn ceremonies. And many of these tribes lost these copper plates during Trail of Tears type events. While they were being displaced around the country, they would bury them so that they wouldn't get lost or stolen along the way. And that's something that these tribes would still be using today if they still had them, if they hadn't been lost under those circumstances. So, if we ever were to dig those up, those would be repatriated under this law of NAGPRA, along with the human remains and the grave goods. But in 2024, There've been several updates to NAGPRA, but the biggest one and the most recent one happened in 2024. And Deb Haaland, the previous Department of Interior secretary, she completely erased that balance of science and respect. And I mean, she quite explicitly said that despite that being the initial intention of the law, it's not explicitly written into the law. It was just part of the conversation. And so she's removed that and made this law solely about repatriation. And the response from institutions and archaeologists, because this law is incredibly vague, it really says very little of anything. It doesn't give specific actions to take. It just kind of says all of this stuff needs to be respected. And the response that's been taken in to this most recent update is to remove everything. So on January 12th, 2024, every single museum across America, save for a very small handful, were forced to close down their Native American exhibits. Some of them had to resort to throwing tarps over their exhibits because they were now illegal to present to the public. Tens of thousands of images, so any images of artifacts online that these institutions used to have got deleted January 12th, 2024. And it's become almost a blanket ban on Native American archaeological information as far as the public is able to access it.
So that sounds like it's gone off the rails quite a bit.
I would say so.
What was the original process that institutions and museums had to comply with? Because it surely, if that was going on in 1990 when it was enacted, a lot of the museums I got to grow up seeing as a kid, I'm sure you went to that are now closed and blanketed, like you mentioned, that wasn't going on when we were kids. So what was by contrast, what was the process like for institutions back then? Because what's going on now seems very different to what we grew up with.
Right. So in the past, if you were conducting a dig and say you find artifacts and or bodies, the archaeologists would study these things and they would try to associate them with modern tribes. Obviously something that's 10,000 years old is very unlikely to have an association to a modern tribe, but things that were more recent, a lot of archaeology is actually post-colonial. It's after Columbus came. So they would look at the artifacts and compare them to other known artifacts to, do comparative analysis. Hey, this looks like it's from this tribe. They would do DNA testing. DNA testing is often destructive, so it's actually not done all that much in America. But when they have DNA, they would compare it to modern tribes' DNAs. If there's matches, that's a good sign that it's a close relation to that tribe. And they would also use geographical information, which is difficult because of all of those Trails of Tears types of events. But this is what they would look at, and then they would try to figure out what tribe is most closely associated with it. And then they would enter a conversation with that tribe and go, do you want these things back? Not all tribes want everything back. Sometimes they go, no, you can keep it, you can display it, you can study it, various degrees of permission that they might give. Or they request it back, and at which point they go through the repatriation process, which is a lot of paperwork and consultation and rather expensive. And with the most recent update, the financial burden was pretty drastically increased. So not only were these museums forced to close down due to the update making it illegal for them to display these things, but many museums have, maybe not many, but there are museums that have permanently closed as a result of this update because they just can't afford to stay open anymore and meet the regulations. And now,
Okay.
if in contrast, if you want to know how it works now, it's been written into the law that archaeologists must defer to native wisdom. Again, everything about this law is incredibly vague. What does that mean exactly? And it's not spelled out. So now that process, depending on which institution is handling this, some of them are taking the stance that just whatever a tribe says, that's what we do. There are no other factors to consider. We must defer to the native wisdom. So if a tribe says we want that back, regardless of what it is or whose it might be, as long as it's not contested by another tribe, it gets returned now.
Okay, so if the whole point of the law was for repatriation of artifacts, how effective has that actually been in doing it accurately and doing it in the right ways? Are these things just being boxed up and dropped off? Or are we making sure there's proper, handling of these things, and then any sort of display or because I heard you mention that websites were even taken down about it and information deleted about it. So how effective has this actually been in repatriating these artifacts? Because it sounds like they're just kind of wholesale being sent back, but what's going on there?
So, the initial 1990 version, what was meant to be repatriated under the initial NAGPRA laws and regulations, about 95% of that has been and had been, I want to say, around like 2011. Don't quote me on that year, though. So it did take a while. I mean, that's still over 20 years, but they did repatriate the vast majority of things that could be associated with tribes and that tribes wanted to be repatriated. But as updates keep coming in, that net of repatriation keeps growing larger and larger. So if you ask Google if this has been effective, it'll tell you it's a massive failure because there's all of these things that haven't been repatriated, but they were never intended to be under the initial law. There were some other parts to your question. What? I apologize. You asked.
It seems like the items are there's not really a proper chain of command being
right. So
implemented. There's not
that process. The process of actually repatriating this, it's all confidential. So I honestly can't tell you a whole lot about the specific procedures around how these things are like packaged and delivered. My understanding is that they take great care in making sure that they are packaged properly, that they're delivered properly, that they're not going to be, damaged or lost in that process. So I do believe they're doing that part properly, but it's all handled in the same way that secret information is. So when a repatriation happens, all of the documentation that goes along with it, the process that goes along with it, that's all confidential, and it's all handled on a case-by-case basis between the tribe and the institution. So there's not necessarily a singular method that they use. But yeah, we don't get to know what's repatriated unless the tribe chooses to publicize that. But as far as the institutions are concerned, that's all held very close. The public is not allowed to see any of that. And like I said, the net of things that are getting repatriated keeps growing. And because NAGPRA is so vague, each institution, it really is up to them what they want to repatriate. And a lot of institutions since 2024 are taking the stance of literally everything. So literally anything that can be associated with Native Americans gets repatriated. This not only includes remains and artifacts, it includes recreations of artifacts, artistic depictions of artifacts, modern art that's created by Native Americans. I mean, truly, literally anything. And that's not every single institution, but it seems to be the largest institutions, and the biggest and the ones with most influence are taking that stance. Your small local museum, which is just a small local museum, they might not be taking such drastic measures, but pretty much all of the major institutions are.
Okay. Well, so my concern isn't necessarily the physical handling of it. I'm sure they do a great job making sure it's, packaged and cared for correctly in that way. But when I say a proper chain of custody and stewardship, the concern I have is if this information is publicly available, and these artifacts were publicly available, and the wider public outside of the tribe was learning and being educated on our indigenous cultures, and then they're just being secretly, displaced who knows where. They're kind of just artifacts and art and manuscripts and a variety of different things that we have that help us understand the indigenous people that were here before any of the settlers showed up. How has that been positive for the native communities? Because I feel like the idea of putting the artifacts back in their hands is exactly what we want to see, but them disappearing is not what we want to see. How has this been helpful for them? What are the tribes actually gaining from this? Do you know?
It's a very good question, and one I probably can't answer. There's different opinions amongst tribes, just like there's different opinions amongst everyone. There's a movement called indigenous data sovereignty, which certain members of certain tribes are currently pushing. And it's the idea, like I was just saying, where literally any information about Native Americans, they want it sequestered. They want it completely removed from the public. No one is able to access it without direct permission from Native Americans. And so some tribes do want this outcome. They do want everything removed and taken from display, and they don't want anyone to see it. And I really don't understand that mentality. The reason that I got into this topic is because I called the Ohio History Connection just over a year ago. And while I was on the phone with them, I said, hey, I'm trying to learn about Native Americans. Been trying to view their artifacts. I've been looking online, and I've been able to find almost nothing. And this was after the update, obviously. And the response I got was a chuckle, followed by, yeah, no, you're not going to find anything like that due to the federal regulations. So, yeah, I don't understand why they would want that. I would think they would want people to learn about their history, but like I said, there's different groups amongst everyone, and I don't believe that's a majority of natives that want a full sequestering of their data. But a lot of this discretion, like I said, is up to the universities, it's up to the museums, it's up to these institutions because of the way NAGPRA works. And so I think that out of an abundance of caution, the approach they've chosen to take is to just remove everything from display rather than, the more difficult option, which is figuring out how to actually handle these things appropriately.
Okay, so you've mentioned the update that happened recently, and what exactly, because I know the original intent of that was to streamline the process, and I know there's a lot of tribes that said the process was taking too long, or there were, big holes in the process that needed to be addressed. So it was meant to be a helpful thing, but it seems like now it's just kind of an anything goes type deal. How is the update been beneficial in any way? Because it doesn't seem like it's had the intended effect there either. It's
well, there was a deadline put on it, so there's 5 years for everything that should be repatriated to be repatriated. Included in that deadline and included in the update was the removal of unaffiliated. So earlier I was talking about how these institutions would try to affiliate these things with modern tribes. And if they couldn't be affiliated, like I said, some things 10,000 years old, it's pretty difficult to associate that to a modern tribe.
Like Mississippian or Clovis,
they wouldn't be repatriated
when they're found, right? That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, these very ancient remains, and even sometimes not so ancient. There's tribes that have gone extinct, right? And that's happened more recently than 10,000 years ago, certainly. So there are things that are found that can't be affiliated to these modern tribes, and that used to be, built into NAGPRA, that you were able to say, yeah, this doesn't have a modern association. And so that in those cases would be kept by the museums for study, or they would be reburied if the museum chose to do that. But it was up to the museums. Now with the update, unaffiliated no longer exists. So every single thing that is found in America must be affiliated with a modern tribe, and it must be offered for repatriation within the next 5 years. So, as I said earlier, tribes don't necessarily want everything back. And you were talking about these artifacts, being removed and just disappearing. And unfortunately, that is what's happening now. Not necessarily disappearing like they cease to exist, but they're disappearing from the public view.
Sure.
And a lot of people and a lot of tribes want to have their own museums, essentially, so that after repatriating these objects, they can display them themselves. And I think that would be a great thing, but the infrastructure isn't there currently. So what is actually happening is they're being taken from, public view, and they are being returned to these tribes, but the tribes don't have anywhere to display them. So, they end up sitting in a warehouse, or the tribes do end up reburying them. And maybe at some point in the future, these things will return to public view if the tribes want them to and the infrastructure gets built. But as of right now, they're gone. And I'm honestly, my outlook for the future is pretty grim for all of this. It's not a positive outlook. I know politics make everything a little spicier, but this is an inherently political issue. Over 99% of archaeologists in America lean left, and archaeology is a very isolated branch of academia. They don't interact with other branches a whole lot, and they really don't interact with the public hardly at all. And so they are in this echo chamber of left-leaning ideas, and because there's no one there to give any pushback, it can really only move in one direction. It can only get more extreme. And the point we're at now is that a lot of archaeologists hold the opinion that archaeology is a colonial sin. It is this racist, evil, oppressive act that was done in the past, and the only way to correct that today is to erase all of that and to get rid of all of that. And so it's not every archaeologist that thinks this way, but there's enough of them, and there's so few voices of dissent within archaeology. In fact, there's literally one voice of dissent, and that's Elizabeth Weiss. She is the only active archaeologist who is pushing back against NAGPRA, as far as I know. And so my outlook for the future is that these things will continue becoming more and more restricted, more and more will be erased. Some of the things that have been repatriated, both before and after this update, are coprolites, human feces, garbage, literal garbage, animal bones, not from any practice or ritual, but just from eating, things like that, scraps of human hair, like I said, modern art. So I think that trend, unfortunately, is only going to grow, and we're going to see even broader sweeping repatriation and even broader sweeping removal of information from the public, unfortunately.
Well, so I want to circle back to the culturally unidentifiable objects, because for, things that have nothing to do with the tribes, why are those being given back? And, so the net result essentially that you're saying is things, from the Clovis culture, who knows what, that are found in the region of a modern day indigenous tribe, those are being forced reallocated back to the modern tribe. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct. Yes. And that is what this new update does. So if you're familiar with the Kennewick man, he was, I think, 8,500 years old. And when he was discovered, it was actually assumed it was a modern murder victim initially, and not an 8,500-year-old skeleton. And one of the reasons for this is because the bone structure didn't resemble Native American bone structure. It more closely resembled European bone structure. And then testing was done. They realized what an incredible find this was, that it was 8,500 years old. And initially, this was before the 2024 update, so it couldn't be repatriated under NAGPRA. There were tribes that were calling for it. There were archaeologists that were calling for it to be repatriated under NAGPRA, and they couldn't do that because it didn't have that modern association. And so Barack Obama actually issued an executive order to repatriate the Kennewick man, who was reburied in a secret location under like 10 tons of gravel and concrete so that it could never be accessed again. But now today, under this 2024 update, that would be repatriated. It would have to be associated with a modern tribe, and it would have to be repatriated. And this whole idea of associating everything to a modern tribe, I don't know if you believe in diffusion in America, that people reached America before Columbus, that the only migration to America before Columbus wasn't just over the Bering Strait land bridge. I personally do believe in diffusion, and this law legally excludes that idea from study.
We have recent copper finds kind of fly in the face of that. No, it was proved that
the
copper that's been found in Europe came from Michigan.
I think there's still some study going on there, but the initial results seem to indicate that, yes.
Wow.
But
well, I don't want to get off topic here because I'm baffled that this repatriation is happening for people that are not associated even with the modern day tribes and indigenous lineages. So what maybe as a public, as a populace, what can we do to voice the concern of history erasure? Because politics aside, whether you're left, right, center, purple, pink, blue, white, whatever, it shouldn't be an issue of color or gender or race or anything like that. Everybody is a massive melting pot. There is no pure people anymore, except maybe like the Amazonian tribes. Maybe they've been pure for the last, 7,000-8,000 years, whatever. But everybody is a huge harmonious melting pot. When you go through the family lineage, inevitably there are odd inclusions there that are going to add to your genetic, makeup, to the point where we have become a incredibly melted species. So history is everybody's history, as far as I'm concerned.
That's my belief as well.
Whether you share a direct and obvious and known linkage to it or not, I feel like the people in Turkey are still my ancestors just as much as the people in Africa, the people in ancient Asia. I know some of my lineage, and it is a complete melting pot. But really, in 2025, pretty much everybody is like that to some extent. So history belongs to everybody in my book. And what are some things we can do to actually make sure our shared human history is not being swept onto a shelf somewhere, and voice that we actually want to know our shared human past? It's not I am an indigenous, you are not, you're a European. This is our shared human story. How do we do something about this?
Well, the first thing is what we're doing now. It's awareness. People don't know that this is happening. Like I said earlier, the whole thing is confidential. None of this is ever published. It doesn't get talked about. And archaeology is an isolated institution. So, they're doing all of these actions behind the scenes, and no one really knows about it. I only know about it because of that phone call. And then I dedicated the next year of my life to learning about it and studying about it. But people need to know, and they need to get upset about it, quite frankly, because it is very upsetting. And as long as people don't know what's happening, there's no chance of this getting solved. It will just continue to happen in the background until there's nothing left. So awareness needs to be raised, just like the trees at Göbekli Tepe. I mean, that showed that people do obviously care about the ancient past. And that's one 11,000-year-old site that was being slightly mismanaged. This is the history of an entire nation. And, over 30,000 years of human history for an entire country. So I think that if people did know what was happening, they would care greatly. And I think that that's what's required. People need to know, and they need to be upset because they should be. And without people getting upset, these archaeologists and these institutions are just going to keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I unfortunately that Göbekli Tepe was a great example, because that's exactly the sort of mismanagement that I'm sensing out of NAGPRA currently. And ultimately, artifacts belong in the hands of the cultures they belong to. They should be able to share those things and have those things in their reach to be able to rotate out as they see fit. Absolutely. But for them to disappear completely and it be, forced of that nature, like information that's already public now be taken and not be public. And most concerning of all, if artifacts that are not even related to the indigenous people currently living here are being wholesale given to them just because of territory in a modern context, where does the line stop? Where do we actually draw the line and stop that? Because that's an issue, and if left to just go unchecked, that's a real kind of horse let go of the cart type moment. I feel we're heading for as a species interested in our shared human history. So I really do appreciate you coming on and having this conversation today, because it's something that, like you said, really just having the conversation about is going to help. Sharing this, going to @thegoob on social media.
Yes, I tweet about it often.
These are small starts, but what are some other resources, Stephen, that people could dig into if they really want to know, the kind of grittier side of what's happening here, and maybe, something or somebody they can contact about it, or at least look into to, like I say, get that information of, more detailed than we've gone into today.
Yeah. So Elizabeth Weiss is going to be the best resource you can get. She has a ton of experience with this firsthand. She's got a similar story to Jordan Peterson. They came after her viciously because of her stance against NAGPRA. And she's written 2 books on the subject. So, if you want to learn more, there's 2 books you can read. Her most recent book is fantastic. I highly recommend it. The title's a bit of a mouthful, so I don't want to butcher it, but you can look up Elizabeth Weiss and her books. Unfortunately, there's not really any other good resources. Sam Urban, Illegitimate Scholar, he's talked about this a little bit, but myself and Elizabeth Weiss are really the only people who've really dedicated a lot of time to learning and presenting this topic, because it is so obscure. It is so done behind the scenes. There is so little published about it. So if you really want to dig into it, you can go to the Federal Registrar website, the federalregistrar.gov, and there's a question and answer section on the most recent update. It's very, very long. There's 480 questions and 480 responses. But if you do read through those, it will give you a good idea of both the attitudes and opinions of the archaeologists and the institutions, as well as the attitudes and the opinions of the Department of Interior, who is okay. As I was saying.
There we go.
Start now?
I think I got you back now, brother. Go ahead.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so there's not any real good condensed resources of information other than my videos, other than Elizabeth Weiss's book, and some of the videos that Illegitimate Scholar has put out. It is such a niche topic, but you can go to the federalregistrar.gov website. You can read through the comments and answers. Long read, but it'll give you insight into the opinions of the federal agency behind this law, as well as the institutions and the archaeologists who are actually enacting this law. And I have a video, I'll give you the link to put in the description, where it's covering a paper I wrote, which is, the most, for an hour of content, I think that's the most informationally dense source out there currently.
Well, Stephen, I really do appreciate you joining me today because, like you mentioned, the best way for us to enact some change on this is really just going to be having the conversation. And I'm going to link to all the resources down below that you need to find out why this is a cause worth your time and taking a few minutes to share this out, as well as check out Stephen and Elizabeth Weiss's profiles. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you next time back here at the East 10 Outpost. And remember, always be indomitable in your quest for knowledge, no matter what barriers get in your way. But above all, my friends, stay curious.